introduction, and also thanks to the organizers for putting this nice event together and for also being so good about all the COVID stuff. We've had to, pivot a little bit. I'm very impressed with how smoothly everything was adjusted. So that was really great. Yeah, so I'm presenting with a handout. You can download the handout in the chat. I think Nina has put that in there, and then you can just follow along as I speak. This talk is part of a larger project that I'm working on. In this larger project, what I'm looking at are cases in which agents engage in complex deliberation, where they have some, fixed body of evidence, but it's not so easy to see how this evidence bears on some question they're interested in, so it takes them a while to figure this out. And what I want to argue is that the kinds of attitudes, like credences that agents form while they're deliberating, that they can also be more or less rational, just like the conclusions of their reasoning can be more or less rational, but that we need a separate kind of standard of rationality to evaluate those attitudes. And what I'm doing today is kind of giving the sort of Bayesian spin on this project. But I'm going to show you some of the informal cases first that kind of motivate what I'm talking about, and then we're going to sort of the Bayesian version of this. So let's start with a couple of cases. Those are both on your handout. The first case I'm calling logic student. Una is a beginning logic student. She has a list of formulas, and she's asked to determine whether each formula is a tautology or a contradiction. She reads the first formula, which is a tautology, and her credence that it is a tautology is initially at 50%, right? This is like when she first looks at it. She then writes out the truth table and becomes 90% confident that it is a tautology. To check, she is also producing a natural deduction style proof. As a result, she becomes virtually certain that the formula is a tautology, right? So this is kind of a logic case that has this structure of complex deliberation that I'm interested in, where the agent's credences kind of evolve as they reason, landing on sort of like a concluding credence at the end. Here's an empirical case that also has this kind of structure, calling this case framed. Manny has committed a murder and tries to frame Fred for it. Detective Fletcher, upon initially inspecting the evidence, responds as Manny has planned and becomes initially 90% confident that Fred committed the murder. However, Detective Fletcher is very thorough. She thinks about it very carefully, and as she thinks about the evidence more, she realizes that there are some incongruencies in the evidence that ultimately lead her to discover that this was in fact a framing attempt. And so as a result, she concludes, right, that it's very unlikely that Fred is the killer. She reduces her confidence in that claim to 5%. So in other work, I have already introduced some terminology to talk about these cases. And the first sort of piece of terminology I introduced there is I distinguish between terminal attitudes and transitional attitudes. Terminal attitudes are attitudes that we would also commonly call the conclusions of our reasoning, right? What we end up settling on when we're considering our deliberation to be finished. Whereas transitional attitudes are these attitudes that we form while our deliberation is still in progress, right? So when you think about the logic student and the framed examples, basically all the attitudes that aren't the final attitude, those I would call transitional attitudes, right? And those are just keeping track of how plausible certain options look in light of sort of the reasoning that you've completed up to that point. Now, these transitional and terminal attitudes play different roles in reasoning, or so I claim, right? The transitional attitudes are just sort of there to keep track of how our reasoning is evolving, whereas the concluding attitudes are the ones that we settle on, those are the ones that we typically use to base our further reasoning on, to base our actions on, to base our assertions on, whereas transitional attitudes play a much more limited role when it comes to like action and assertion and decision making. And what I want to say is that we actually need two standards of justification to evaluate these two types of attitudes. And the reason for that is that they play different roles, right? So if two attitudes have different jobs, there are different standards for what it means to do the job well. And I argue that for conclusions of reasoning, the standard theories of rationality and justification we have, like, Bayesian theories, reliabilism, evidentialism, whatever your favorite theory is, those are fine for the concluding attitudes, but we need separate and weaker standards of rationality for evaluating these transitional attitudes. So that's kind of the big picture, right? That's kind of the view I generally want to propose, that we need different standards of rationality for transitional and terminal attitudes. And I think that basic kind of claim does not hang on endorsing a very specific view of justification or rationality in epistemology. So what I want to do today is I want to show you how this plays out when we look at the Bayesian framework, and specifically cases in which we're modeling logical learning in a Bayesian framework, which is kind of a well-known problem for Bayesianism that different people have been trying to solve in different ways. I mean, ultimately, I think Bayesianism also has a similar issue when it comes to empirical learning. We can talk about this later if you want, but I just want to focus on the logical learning case for now, because that's one that has recently had a revived discussion in the literature. Okay, so let's get started here. You're all familiar, I assume, with the standard Bayesian model for rational credences, right? We're saying that tautologies and maybe also elementary mathematical truths get credence 1. Then nothing gets a negative credence. And finite additivity says that when you have two mutually exclusive statements, AI and AJ, the probability of their disjunction is the sum of their individual probabilities. And if an agent is supposed to be rational, then their credences have to be representable as following these rules. And standardly, we add to that a rule about how to update on evidence, right? The idea is agents, if they're rational, should conditionalize when they learn new stuff. And we have the usual definition of conditional probability. But the well-known problem is that if we start out this way, then these standard Bayesian models require that rational agents are logically infallible, right? So insofar as they have any opinion at all about whether something is a tautology or a contradiction or what the logical relations are between different claims, they have to already kind of have the correct credence assigned to that in order to count as rational. There's no such thing as sort of rational logical learning or improvement within a Bayesian model. Okay, give me 1 second here. Okay, so now what do? One attempt to expand the Bayesian framework to deal with logical learning is to introduce what's called personal possibilities. And this is an idea that comes originally from a paper by Ian Hacking from the 60s. And Richard Pettigrew has kind of picked up this idea recently and sort of spelled it out a bit more and integrated it with recent research about Dutch books and accuracy arguments. And the basic idea here is that when we set up our Bayesian models, instead of starting with a logical language that sort of gives us all the logical possibilities, instead, we set up the probability framework over a set of personal possibilities, which are the things that are sort of left open by what the agent considers possible. And here's a quote from Pettigrew about how to think about these personal possibilities. I'm not married to this particular way of defining them. This is just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Pettigrew says, a world is personally possible for a particular individual at a particular time if, by this time, this individual hasn't ruled it out by their experiences, their logical reasoning, their conceptual thinking, their insights, their emotional reactions, or whatever other cognitive activities and processes can rule out worlds for an individual. Okay, so if we use these personal possibilities, then we get new versions of the rules for probability. So normalization then looks something like this. For any statement A, if not A is not personally possible for an agent, then the probability of A has to be 1. For any statement A, the probability of A has to be above 0. And for any statements AI and AJ, such that it is not personally possible for an agent that AI and AJ are both true at the same time, then their disjunction has to be the sum of their individual. The probability of their disjunction has to be the sum of the probabilities of the individual statements. And now and this basic idea that we could, define personal probabilities this way comes from hacking. But then what Pettigrew adds in a 2020 paper is he shows that we can replace logical possibilities with personal possibilities in the standard arguments for coherence and conditionalization. So we can take Dutch book arguments or accuracy dominance arguments and all these arguments, we kind of bring them over into this new framework. And what we then show is that the framework demands coherence, but with regard to what's personally possible for the agent, not with regard to the logical possibilities. I'm just going to give you a little example now to illustrate what that might look like. I'm using an example here of mathematical learning. If you think mathematically is super interestingly different from logic in this respect, you can supply your own example that involves, strictly speaking, logical learning, but I think the math example is just very intuitive, so that's why I picked it. So suppose you're at a restaurant with 7 friends and you want to split the bill evenly. Now, I picked this example because I thought this math was sufficiently difficult that you wouldn't immediately know what the answer is, right? If I say, oh, the bill is $100 and you're going with 4 friends, then everybody immediately knows it's $25. But this is supposed to be one where you don't immediately know what's 200 divided by 7. So you start out thinking, okay, I could be in world B, and in world B the bill is over $200. In world not B, the bill is $200 or less. S says your share is over $28.57, and not S says your share is $28.57 or less. And before you do the math, your personal possibilities are these 4. Now, W2 and W3 are the worlds where in W2 the bill is over $200, but your share is $28.57 or less. And then in W3, the bill is under 200, but your share is over $28.57. That's not mathematically possible. So in a standard Bayesian model, those would not be included, right? Because they're supposed to be already excluded because it's like mathematically impossible that this could happen. But when we're talking about your personal possibilities, when you haven't done the math yet, right, then those are still included. Now, a possible learning process could then look like this. Maybe initially your credences are equally distributed over those 4 worlds. Say the bill comes and you learn that the bill is over $200. So then you rule out W3 and W4 and update your credences in the first 2 worlds. And then you actually do the math and you realize, okay, well, if the bill is over $200, then I definitely have to pay more than $28.57. And then you land on W1 with all of your credence, right? So this is how this personal probability framework could model a process of like simple mathematical learning or logical learning or something like this. Now, initially, it looks like this is kind of an attractive way of modeling logical learning in kind of like a relaxed Bayesian framework. But I think that there are at least 2 problems with this way of doing it. Now, I think the first problem is that we open the door for updating on false claims as long as the agent becomes certain of them. And also, I think, and this is more of an interpretive problem of what the framework means, we can no longer interpret priors as modeling an agent's epistemic standards. So I'm going to walk you through those 2 problems one at a time now. Okay. First problem. So when we look at standard arguments for conditionalization, like the Dutch book argument or the accuracy argument, those arguments usually assume that when an agent becomes certain of something, it must be true. And this is an assumption I call factivity. But independently of this personal probability stuff, some people have argued that that's too restrictive, right? Because sometimes you can think about, for example, you have a brain in a vat. The brain in a vat, becomes certain that, it's nighttime or whatever. by looking at the sky, and it seems like maybe the brain in the vat is like, should become certain of that and update on it. And then we could say that that's a rational update, and maybe we want to then like adapt the arguments for conditionalization to say that if the agent rationally becomes certain of something, even if it happens to be false, they should still update. But the problem is that once we combine all of this, and there have been some results in the literature that show that you can remove this factivity assumption from these arguments for conditioning, if you put this all together with the personal probability framework, you get the result that if an agent happens to become certain of a logical falsehood or of a mathematical falsehood, then they must update on those on pain of being judged irrational. But to me, that seems kind of backwards, right? It seems that when an agent becomes certain of a logical falsehood or a mathematical falsehood, that seems like, at least in a lot of circumstances, like it would be irrational not to update on that, right? So it seems like what we're getting here is kind of the opposite of what we wanted, right? So if we think back of the lunch bill example, right? Suppose that you just do the math wrong, and instead of landing on W1 as the actual world, you land on W2, just because your calculations were wrong. And then it looks like this framework now says, yeah, you definitely have to condition on that, and you're irrational if you don't. And that seems not great. So that's the first problem. So we can't of course we can always appeal to extra systematic constraints to say that you've done something wrong or that you're irrational, but the framework itself doesn't deliver this criticism. There's a second problem, and this is a bit more abstract and has something to do with how we interpret Bayesianism. And this is about how we should interpret somebody's priors, right? So one thing that's very clear is that we shouldn't think priors are the things that babies are born with, right? Like it's not like the credences that you have at birth and then you start learning stuff and then you update, right? That's like a sort of very implausible interpretation of what priors are. I think the more popular and more plausible interpretation of what somebody's priors are is that they are somebody's evidential standards, right? Your priors tell us something about what you think is evidence for what and how good evidence it is for that thing, right? Because it tells us, your priors determine all your conditional probabilities, and then we can see, oh yeah, so this person would update, on this evidence in this way and on this evidence in this way. And so we learn something about how you judge sort of evidential relationships. And that seems good. Now, I think what follows also from this idea of what priors are is that we should think that your priors can commit you to certain things, even if you haven't worked these things out yet, right? So for example, if I would say that according to my evidential standards, I should do basic math in certain ways. And that's true even if at this point right now, I haven't worked out, the answer to every math problem. My evidential standards still commit me to considering certain answers to be correct or incorrect. I might just have to do some work to get there. So, but something weird happens when we use the framework of personal probability to model mathematical and logical learning, because then we can no longer understand the agent's priors in this way. Because if we kind of leave all these personal possibilities open, right, and some of them are things that are actually not, technically logically possible, and so there really aren't any consequences of your evidential standards that are represented in your priors that you haven't worked out yet. It's like what your own evidential standards require of you is kind of exhausted by what you recognize at that moment. Like there's nothing that, your priors kind of commit you to that, you maybe haven't worked out yet. This is what happens when you kind of put in these personal possibilities. So basically what that means is if we define your priors over your personal possibilities, then they can no longer encode your your evidential standards in this usual sense. What they are, what your personal probability priors are only the evidential standards that you have currently worked out, right? They don't commit you to anything that you haven't currently worked out. And so what that means is, in the personal probability model, we don't really have a way of capturing what your evidential standards are in the way that the standard Bayesian model could deliver. And I think that is an unattractive feature of the personal probability model. But again, it depends on thinking that the original interpretation of priors in the standard model had a bunch of things going for it. If you don't think that, maybe you wouldn't be so moved by this problem. Okay, now, what do we do? Well, one other thing you might consider doing here is there's a different strategy that people have employed in the literature sometimes to try to make Bayesian models less idealized. And so, for example, like Sinan Dogramachi has been arguing for this for a while. And instead of saying, let's define the rules of probability over what's personally possible for you, we instead relativize Bayesian norms to what you could in principle figure out. Not relative to what you have already figured out or what you're currently recognizing, but we're just saying, you know, keep the standard Bayesian norms in place, but if something is too hard for you to think about, it doesn't deliver any norms for those cases. And then we get something like this. The normalization norm would look something like this. If you have considered B, and you can know that P is a tautology, then the rational credence in it is 1, right? So the other norm says, if you do know it's a tautology, it gets 1. This says, if you can know it's a tautology, it is 1, right? So it does that. Or additivity then becomes this rule that if you can know that these two things are mutually exclusive, then you have to apply the additivity rule in your credence assignments. Now, this proposal actually has some nice advantages over the personal probability approach, because when we go for this, since agents can't know things that are false, we're not telling agents to update on falsehoods, right? At least not in cases where it's possible for them to know the truth about relevant claims. And in those cases, we can also have this interpretation of priors as somebody's evidential standard. So that problem is solved as well by this proposal. But now we're back to a version of Bayesianism that can't actually model these steps of logical learning. Because if we say you have to assign, you know, say, credence 1 to every formula that you can figure out as a tautology, right? Then it already kind of like says you have to be kind of logically omniscient in this sort of sphere that's sort of like cognitively, in principle, accessible to you. It gets you off the hook for the stuff that's way too hard, but now we don't have this like stepwise learning in the model anymore. So we're kind of back to the same problem that we encountered before. Now, I think that we're at a bit of a dilemma here. So now, the first one of the dilemma is this. Suppose that we endorse Bayesian norms that are weak enough to allow for logical learning, something like personal probabilism. Then we can't interpret the agent's priors as their epistemic standards anymore, and we can't criticize agents who become certain of an update on logical falsehoods, right? Quite the opposite. These factivity-free arguments for conditioning, when we put them into the personal probability models, they leave agents rationally criticizable if they don't condition on their certainties in logical falsehoods and mathematical falsehoods. Then the second horn of the dilemma is this. Suppose that we tighten the norms back up to fix these problems, for example, by either going back to standard probabilism or by endorsing this like cognitive ability relative probabilism. Then we again rule out the ability to model logical learning, because we're putting constraints on what's rational for an agent to think that are just basically sensitive to all the logical things that the agent in principle could know. And so that's kind of, gets us back to where we started in a way. So what I want to say, the solution to this is, I want to say, look, you're trying to do too much with one model. You are trying to pack all these things that you want into one model that should better be divided up over two models that do different things. And this is kind of where this distinction between two standards of rationality that I started with kind of comes back in sort of like a Bayesian guise. And so here's what I think this might look like if we if we want sort of to represent all of these things I've been kind of mentioning. So what I think, if we want to model logical learning, we should actually combine two Bayesian models with each other, where one model is a personal probability model, and the job of that model is to actually track those steps in logical reasoning and how you're eliminating possibilities as you're doing logical reasoning. But then we can combine that with a second model, which is either a standard Bayesian model or one of these ability relativized models. And what that model does is it actually represents the rational conclusions that the agent can reach or that the agent should arrive at. And if we have this kind of combination of models, then there's 4 combinations that we could encounter here. So here's one option that we could encounter. We could encounter the case where the agent is rational both according to the personal probability model, right? They're meeting all the constraints of that. And they're also meeting all the constraints of the second model, the standard model. How do we interpret this? Well, what this means is that the personal and the logical possibilities in this case are actually aligned. So that means that basically the agent has exhausted their opportunities for logical learning because they've basically ruled out all the logically impossible worlds until their personal probability model basically like lines up exactly with what the model says that's defined over the logical possibilities. So here we have a rational agent who's done all of their logical learning correctly, basically. So that's one thing that could come out of this representation. Second possibility, we could have somebody who is rational according to the personal probability model, but not according to the standard Bayesian model that represents the rational conclusions. What's happening here? Well, in this case, the agent has not aligned their personal possibilities with the logical possibilities, and that could mean 2 things. One option is that the agent could come to align their personal possibilities with the logical possibilities via further updating by conditioning. So that would mean the agent hasn't made any sort of wrong moves yet. They've maybe already ruled out some things that are not logically possible, but they're not done yet. There's some space still to do some more logical learning, and until they would sort of align their credences with what the Bayesian standard model says they should sort of have as their rational conclusions. But there's sort of nothing wrong here. It just means the agent is not like logically omniscient. The second possibility is that the agent has actually become certain of some logical falsehoods. And in that case, what happens is there's no path with which the agent could bring the personal probability model into alignment with the standard Bayesian model just by further updating, right? And if that's what's going on, then we know there's some irrationality going on because the agent has mistakenly assigned certainty to a logical falsehood or a mathematical falsehood. And so they would have to kind of go back and fix that before they can condition their way to alignment with the standard Bayesian model. So we can kind of catch why there's a problem. There's like a diagnosable problem of, having updated on one of these falsehoods. Now, the third possibility is that the agent is not rational according to the personal probability model, but is rational according to the standard Bayesian model. I mean, that's sort of in principle a possibility, but actually, if we think about what that would have to look like, we find that this option is either impossible or irrational, right? So if somebody is rational according to a standard Bayesian model and has arrived at their credences through proper reasoning, then we should be in the first case where their personal possibilities and the standard Bayesian model align, right? So the only thing I think that could be going on here maybe is that it could be that instead of coming to have these like Bayesian rational credences through proper deliberation, maybe they came to have those credences through like a knock on the head or something. So they're like representable by a Bayesian model, but not rational in the sense of doxastically rational because of good deliberation. But if that happened, then there's also a problem with the personal probability model because, of course, the personal probability model also wants you to do proper reasoning and not just have your credences through a knock on the head. But that's kind of like, sort of extra systematic in a way. The fourth possibility is that the agent is not rational according to either the personal or the standard Bayesian model, right? They sort of diverge from the demands of both of these models, in which case the agent is clearly irrational, and then we would have to sort of see further exactly what's going on there. But I think that using these combination models to represent logical learning solves the problems that we encountered when we were trying to kind of do it all with one specific model. Because now what we can do is we can kind of divide and conquer the different sort of jobs a little bit that we need our models to do. So we can model the steps in logical learning via the personal probability component, but these combination models don't condone becoming certain of logical falsehoods, because if you become certain of a logical falsehood, you sort of block your path to conditioning your way towards aligning your credences with a standard Bayesian model. So we can see that there's sort of like an issue that's in the that we can identify in the combination model. And we can now also find a place again for representing the agent's evidential standards, because the standard Bayesian model that represents the rational conclusions that the agent can reach, those can be interpreted as representing the agent's evidential standards that kind of the agent is kind of working towards satisfying by, reasoning according to the steps in the personal probability model. So, and I don't want to be committed here to saying that this is like the best way of representing logical learning, right? There's like probably many other interesting ways of representing logical learning, and I'm not wedded to doing it the Bayesian way. My claim is kind of more conditional. I want to say, if you're Bayesian and you like this idea for representing logical learning with these personal probability models, you run into these problems that you can solve if instead you're willing to work with those combination models. And it shouldn't be surprising that those combination models do a better job than single models, because the kind of problems we encounter here kind of mirror problems that I've identified elsewhere when we try to kind of say how we want to represent the attitudes that are rational during reasoning and the attitudes that are rational conclusions of reasoning. So that's it.